Hey, everybody, welcome to the Grow Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Kevin McNulty, and this is your personal development school of growth, where each week my guests and I will bring and break down big ideas and practices that will help you learn, grow, and succeed in life. Thanks for checking us out. Now let the growth begin. Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Grow Yourself, your personal development school of growth, where we dive deep into topics to, I hope shape us, teach us, push us to grow, to be better people every day. And I got a question kind of start this one off and just to ask, have you ever achieved something, landed a great deal, a great new job, received recognition about something or hit a major milestone only to feel like you really didn't deserve it? In fact, you have sort of this nagging thought in your head telling you that, at any moment, somebody's going to discover that I'm not quite who they think I am, or I don't quite have the goods. And this is known as imposter syndrome. And it's kind of a silent, sort of a relentless voice, I guess you could say, of self doubt that just to whatever degree convinces you or makes you suspect that your success is really a fluke. And by the way, it affects everyone. It can affect children, students, all the way up to CEOs and highly accomplished people. You might be surprised. It's everywhere, but the thing about it is we have a guest today that's going to break all of this down for you. I'm really quite excited about this. I've experienced imposter syndrome. I can honestly say that I still experience it from time to time if perhaps depending on who I'm around, I think sometimes. But in any event, we're going to break this down and really look at it, not just to understand imposter syndrome, but to maybe help you, just fully own your stuff, your greatness, if you want to put it that way. So my guest is Dr. Richard Orbé-Austin. He's a renowned psychologist, an executive coach, a co-founder of Dynamic Transitions Psychological Consulting, and very interesting because this is as many of you all know who watch my show. That's my thing is transitions. He's a TEDx speaker along with his wife, by the way, and the best-selling author, again, along with his wife and partner, Dr. Lisa Orbé-Austin, of the books Own Your Greatness and Your Unstoppable Greatness, and now his newest book, or their newest book, I should say, Your Child's Greatness. All of these provide a roadmap for raising confident, emotional, resilient kids. Dr. Orbé-Austin has been featured in Forbes, Fast Company, and the Today Show, and his work focuses on leadership development, and burnout prevention and helping people basically achieve their ultimate goals. So I want you to get ready for this really empowering conversation about unlocking your greatness and creating a life that's free from self-doubt and these other sorts of things. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Richard Orbé-Austin. Dr. Orbé-Austin, so great to have you here.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so thrilled to be here, and thank you for such a wonderful introduction, Kevin.
Well, your work is very impressive, I must say, and particularly, I mean, I've kind of interacted, really even talked about imposter syndrome from at least a practical standpoint, and even from sort of an experienced standpoint. But I haven't had a guest on this show that could really speak more eloquently and really kind of dive into it. So I'm truly excited about having you here. Listen, before we get started, can you just tell my audience a little bit about, who is Rich? Who is Rich Orbé-Austin?
Sure. So I am a lifelong New Yorker. So I was born in Brooklyn, raised in Queens to Haitian immigrants. And I'm a psychologist by training. I'm left-handed, which is always a unique fact when I talk to people about who I am. And I'm someone who's really passionate about supporting people to really, as you said, unlock their greatness. I truly believe there's greatness in everyone. And one of the ways that I feel that I can serve is to really engage and connect people to really identify and unlock their true potential. And so I'm thrilled to be able to be here today to talk a little bit more about this issue of imposter syndrome and how to overcome it ultimately, because I think there are many misconceptions about it, but I do want to make sure people understand it can be conquered.
Before I ask you about what is imposter syndrome, let me ask you this, perhaps a bit of an odd question, but what is greatness? I mean, when I think of aspiring to greatness, what should I think about?
So this is an excellent question, right? Because the reason I talk about greatness rather than perfection is oftentimes people think striving for greatness means not making any mistakes and being perfect. And
Right.
that is not the reality. When I talk about greatness, it's really being able to help you optimize whatever skills and talents that you have that you want to fully cultivate. And so greatness can be domain specific, greatness can be based on what you value ultimately. And so when I talk about the fact that everyone has greatness in them, it's not that they will be a Nobel laureate or they will become president. It is them being able to feel like this is something that I want and I will be able to continue to strive to achieve it and continue to strive to unlock my true potential and talent.
Oh, I love that. The true potential, I think, is the key word. I just saw this video here. I was a couple of weeks ago about this young girl. I mean, she was probably 12 or something, and she was kind of messing around with a soccer ball in front of soccer players.
Right.
And I don't remember exactly how it unfolded, but she, whether they were attracted to come over there or she kind of enticed them. But these were some serious soccer players. She brought them over there and showed them her greatness. It was pretty impressive. And I remember thinking, wow, that's great. That would
Mm-hmm.
be greatness, right? I mean,
Yes,
just that.
that is exactly it. That is exactly it. Right on the head.
And so imposter syndrome is one of those things that either, prevents you from getting to greatness or fools you into believing that you don't have this greatness. So what is
Yes.
imposter syndrome, Rich?
So, imposter syndrome is a term that was coined almost 50 years ago, in 1978, by two female psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, who were working with a group of high achieving graduate students, professors at a institution in Georgia. And what they noticed about these women, specifically at the time it was women that they were working with, are that despite them feeling high achieving, they always felt that they were a fraud, that they were going to be found out, that these achievements did not really matter in terms of them demonstrating their true talent or potential. So they coined the term imposter syndrome to talk about this phenomenon. So imposter syndrome is not a mental health disorder. So I want to say that first. It's more of what we call a phenomenon, like a particular thing of note that we want to be able to identify. And what it is ultimately is this feeling that you are a fraud, you're going to be found out. You tend to attribute your success to luck or to a key relationship. You tend to overestimate others, underestimate yourself. You find it very difficult to internalize any of your skills or talents. You constantly believe that the only way that you won't be found out is to either overwork or to be perfect, which leads to uh, challenges related to either mental health kind of challenges. Imposter syndrome has been linked to higher rates of anxiety and depression. And so when we're talking about it, the reality is you've noted 70% of people will experience some level of imposter feelings in at one point in their lives. And so oftentimes people who are dealing with imposter syndrome believe they're the only ones that have it. And so they suffer in silence because they feel embarrassed, they feel ashamed that people will be like, you're high achieving. Like, what are you talking about? You don't feel like you deserve it. But the majority of the population will experience it at one point or another. So it is something important for us to talk about and to fully understand.
That is crazy. I'll tell you, and I guess I should have expected it, but I can guarantee. I know for me, I was sitting there thinking about me and my life going, man, this dude's nailing it. He's exactly right. But I bet you so many people watching this are immediately going, yeah, boy. And some
Mm-hmm.
may not even realize that they are suffering from this, if you want to call it that. But
Right.
may I ask why? Why, okay, so many people struggle from it, and some of it may be just a lack in confidence, but those maybe who really are experiencing let's say a moderate to serious amount of
Mm-hmm.
imposter syndrome, why? Where does it come from?
So this is another great question to really dispel some of the myths because I think oftentimes people don't fully recognize where it comes from. It comes from and it tends to come from your origin story, if you will. So early childhood experiences, oftentimes either how you were actually labeled in terms of your role in a particular family. So for instance, if you were identified as the quote unquote smart one, that even though your siblings or other people in your family may have done just as well academically, you were identified as a naturally academically gifted one. And so, in holding that role, as you went through your academic experiences, if you at some point hit some level of challenge, say you fail a test, you get to college, you don't do as well, you start to feel like, well, maybe I'm not as smart. Maybe I'm a fraud. That was never necessarily the case. So that's one role that contributes to the development of imposter syndrome. In contrast, there's a role of an individual who was not identified as a smart one, but more the socially adept one, the quote unquote hardworking one. And even though that person may have had just as good of grades as the smart one, they were told in essence that the only way you can be successful is to really work hard because maybe you're not as academically gifted. And so they then also believe that the only way that they can succeed is to be perfect, to not make mistakes because they're just not as smart, even though that's not actually true. And then the third role that we talk about is this role of the survivor. So someone who in growing up may have been neglected and no one was around enough to tell them what their skills were, what their talents were, whether they were smart or hardworking. And so their belief is they're just looking to survive. And so they always feel like they may be found out because they've never internalized a true sense of who they are. Another dynamic that contributes to it is if you're in a household where there's a narcissistic parent and you're told that the only thing you need to do is please that parent and that your success, your achievements are a signal to the success of that parent. And therefore, you're never able to really value some of the things that you are able to achieve on your own. And then finally, if you grow up in a codependent family where there's an identified quote unquote patient where all the emotional focus is on that person to really
Mm.
make sure that they're taken care of. And again, you are not necessarily catered to or cultivated in terms of your own talents or gifts.
Wow, I would have never suspected, particularly the last one that you talked about. But Rich, what is, I mean, I think most of us kind of understand, generally speaking, what a narcissist is, but how would you sort of define a narcissistic parent?
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about a narcissistic parent, we do talk about it in terms of a clinical term relative to someone who really does not have a full sense of self and looks at themselves as having to be constantly praised, cannot take any type of criticism, believes that everyone
Mm.
needs to just listen to everything that they say, can easily be offended if they are criticized. And what we've often talked about is narcissism develops because of the fact that that person in their own childhood never got the level of attention. And so they developed this kind of inflated sense of self, but ultimately it's really like a house of cards that it can easily be pierced because they are not really believing that they are worthy. And so they need that inflated sense of self to constantly feel like they are good, smart, belong.
And so then how does this eventually sort of, seep over into the child and then to the point where they end up with imposter syndrome or other sorts of conditions, if you want to say?
Sure. So we oftentimes talk about a narcissistic extension, where that narcissistic parent feels like the child is an extension of themselves. And so that child's success or failure is a indication of that parent's success or failure. So therefore, you will see that parent feel like the only time they bring worth to the child or praise the child is if the child did something that they liked. So a child did well in school, a child performed well in a sport, but that when the child does not do well, they tend to dismiss them, remove love from them. And so the signal is for the child that the only way that I can be loved or truly valued is through my successes. And if I don't succeed and I'm not good enough, then that demonstrates that maybe I am an imposter and, I'm not worthy of that love anyway.
You know, I'll probably going to get some hate mail about this, but I think it's been my observation that over the years, and I happen to, as really it's almost just a thing of joy and a bit of, you could almost say community service. I happen to coach middle school tennis players, and teach
Hmm.
them this. And so I get to, I've got, three kids and, and I saw all of them go through middle school. So, I think that's, I think I think all kids are psychotic in middle school. Just kidding. But I remember watching ours, just going, "Oh my God, what's happening to my kid?" And then, well,
Yes.
you do a little reading, you go, "Okay, whew, that's a kind of normal here." But I have just noticed over the years a lot of change in kids and their attitudes, and I think, but
Hmm.
I'm not sure. And of course, in tennis particularly, because it tends to be a smaller group and it's middle school, parents bring their kids and they stay and they watch, and I tend to interact a lot with the parents as well. And you know, and just the parenting, it seems different now. I don't even know what the question is, other than i- are, are my observations correct that children, their mentality, and therefore their behavior is changing more? It may not have to do with imposter syndrome
Hmm.
necessarily.
Hmm. Hmm.
It just
No,
seems, yeah.
you're right on point because we talk about now children growing up in such a hyper competitive environment
Mhm.
that children no longer have free play, that they are so rigidly scheduled. And so when you talk about tennis, I've got a middle schooler and a high schooler, two daughters who are fencers. And
Oh,
so you see the same
interesting.
type of dynamic I'm imagining that you see in tennis, which is very competitive parents who really base again their value on how well their children have done. So we've seen the most horrible things, my wife and I, in terms of parents, kicking their children if they don't do well in a bout, or berating them emotionally if they're not necessarily part of, again, winning in the ways that they want to win. And so to me, that really indicates, as you said, there's a change in a dynamic where children are the lack of joy that we see oftentimes. And we've always said this in terms of fencing for our girls. If you're not enjoying it, yes, it's competitive and you're not always going to enjoy it, but if it's miserable, like we've seen experiences where children
Hmm.
say, if I don't win, I'm
Hmm.
either going to be beaten. If I don't
Hmm.
win, my parent is not going to speak to me or will not give me food. So this is a dynamic and an environment in which we're, operating, which is totally different than, our times as children.
And so you're setting up problems
Hmm.
for the kids, whether
Yes.
whether it be imposter syndrome or narcissism or whatever it is, or just, even just self-hate almost.
Hmm.
You know, I've it's really been a blessing in a lot of ways that I've had this opportunity to coach for probably, it's coming up on 15 years now.
Wow,
And some of the
amazing.
most fascinating parts, Rich, are when, first of all, my approach is to make it enjoyable. And I separate that a little bit from fun, because
Hmm.
I'm fairly serious about teaching them
Right.
tennis.
Right.
I partly believe it's my role to help them grow into high school players. But, I give them multiple ways of winning.
Hmm.
I mix the boys and the girls together. I don't separate
Hmm.
them because I just want them, not to suggest that those aren't two different levels of competition, but I just
Right.
want them to experience the full
Right.
thing.
Right.
And but really the one place that you start to really seep into the kid's psyche is during the matches. They play 8 game pro set. It's 6-love. They're getting crushed.
Mm.
And they sit down on the changeover and they just burst out in tears.
Yes.
And I remember my first few times, like, oh boy, whew, what do I do with this? But then, I just relaxed and would just go and say, hey, man, it sucks, doesn't it? I'd be like, yeah, I said, okay, well, what are we going to do? What's going to happen here? What do you do about this? And I would ask them a question like, how much money are you going to lose, when you lose this, if you lose this match,
Right.
and it's just I don't really even have a question there, but just to say that it's quite the blessing to be a part of a kid's life when they're really struggling, and where I don't impose anything on them. I don't take them away. I let them feel what they're feeling. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not a psychologist, but it
Right.
seems to be just kind of be right there and let them sort it out, figure it out. How do I, I had one kid, I said, well, what do you think you need to do? He said, play better. I was like, okay.
I mean, but they're lucky to have you, right?
Mm,
Because it's clear that you have the emotional intelligence to really key in on what do they need in the moment. That each kid is probably different, certainly different, and that you're not going to just impose one strict particular style on
mm,
each child. You'll check in with them, see what they need, and kind of
mm-hmm,
joke around with them. And a lot of kids, unfortunately, don't get that, right?
mm.
And so when I say that they're lucky to have you, I'm serious about that.
That's very nice of you to say. I appreciate it. Are you familiar with Dr. Carol Dweck's work? I
Yes,
would imagine that you are probably very.
yes.
I remember running across her work several years ago and saying, I mean, in my opinion, I mean, you can correct me as a a doctor and a PhD about this, but she nailed it when she talked about commending your children for their effort as opposed to their outcome. Yes?
Yes. Yes. Because when we talk about the growth mindset, and we talk a lot about it relative to how to overcome imposter syndrome, it really is about this notion of you don't have to be perfect. We all are going to make mistakes, but you see the mistakes as an opportunity to grow, and that you do believe that you have the potential to grow.
Love it.
That's what's exciting about
Love it. Yes, and you're right. You just reminded me that was the primary basis of her work was looking at the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset, and
it.
it was with kids, correct?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and and so teaching your kids that, to just, just put in the effort and we changed my wife and I with our two daughters. My son, he's older, but my two daughters who both played tennis, we started shifting the way that we uh, you know spoke to them instead of, congratulations for the win or whatever. It was like, hey, you worked hard for that. Good for you.
Mm-hmm.
You see,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, yeah. That's exactly it, right? Because language does matter and it does signal a particular message to a child that if you say congratulations on the win, they feel like, okay, well, I will get praise if I win only. And they don't necessarily see, as you said, the effort that's put in, whether they win or lose, right? That if they lose, there's still something to be proud of relative to the effort and what you learn from the losing. It can feel difficult, right? No one wants to lose, but what are you taking away from it that you can apply that next match, that next bout to be able to grow?
And I believe it was her work or in her books where she said to apply this idea, you know, uh, just as an example, I haven't won yet. Was she the one
Yes.
that had this idea that you just enter yet into there?
Right. And that to some extent, quite frankly, also some of the winning is in the learning process, right?
Mm.
That if we're
Oh,
so fixed on the outcome and that we continue to lose, then it becomes difficult. And I always tell the story, with my oldest daughter, it's an incredible story for me to even reflect on. She
please.
first started fencing, she lost all her bouts consistently for over 6 months. And time and again, it was painful to watch. And I commend her, one, because I didn't have that level of resilience. If I was losing anything for probably a month, I'd probably be like, this isn't for me. But what we realized is she really loved the sport,
Oh my.
right? And so she really loved it. And each and every time she would go in and she would lose, but we would talk about what she did well. And she got to that point when she won her first bout. It was like an Olympic
Uh,
victory. Everyone was cheering, everyone was
oh, I got
excited.
chills up my,
And and
yeah.
now she's, she's well established, in her sport and is doing well, it's thriving and is excelling. But that first 6 months was so painful when she started to compete that even my wife and I were like, I don't know, like maybe this may not be for her. But she never wavered. She was like, no, I love, the sport. I love to compete in it, and I'm learning.
And I would assume that she has at least 6 months worth have has taught herself that the win came from the work
Yes,
because she spent
because
so much time working.
yeah, because she was in practice 5 days a week. She
Oof.
was bouting, 5, 6, 7 days a week. So she never again relented, right? Because she knew, as you said, it was the yet. She didn't doubt that she would win eventually. I think even we were like, well, I don't know, right? She would come close, but she didn't. She was like, I'm working. I'm still like, other kids might have been like, I don't want to go anymore. Like, I don't like this. She was like, okay, I'm ready to go to practice. And the work finally broke through for her.
I can't help but to ask, I guess veering slightly away from the topic about you as a dad, but also as a psychologist and therapist and really a well-studied person on the topic. Do you have some advice for parents about with kids that are in sports, maybe even particularly around middle school? Because I'm going to point all my parents to this episode
Yep.
about how to communicate and interact with them relative to their sport.
Yeah, and the reason we actually wrote this third book is because when we would talk about imposter syndrome, oftentimes we would talk about it through the lens of an adult experience. We had a lot of parents coming up to us and saying, "Well, what can we do to make sure to prevent our children from developing this?" And so that third book is really about raising children without imposter syndrome. And one, we talk about the fact that you don't want to make the child feel like they have a fixed role in the family, right? That the smart one could also be the hardworking one and vice versa. You
Mhm.
want to, even though it's very difficult, you want to try to avoid the comparison piece, right? Of like, oh, but your sibling did it this way, and you should be, because it then signals that again their own unique journey. I always talk about the fact, and I always say to parents, recognize that your child is on their own unique journey. Even though you may have had 2 or 3 other children, you feel like, okay, they're going to go through the same. Each child has their own unique
Mhm. That's
journey.
very
And
interesting.
so you want to make sure when you're communicating, you honor that unique journey. One, two, you really want them to be able to understand that it's all right to make a mistake. It's all right to lose. That the key piece is ultimately, what are you learning? That when a child is in that moment, as you
Mm,
said, that they've lost, a sixth love, and they're like, okay, this is horrible. And you come to them and you've done it. You say, well, what can we learn from this and what can we do differently? Right. Rather than, because they're disappointed. They don't want to lose. Right. And
mm.
so it doesn't help for you as a parent. You're disappointed and you don't want them to lose, and you
Yeah.
feel bad. But sometimes as a parent, you may feel like, okay, that child's performance is an indication of me as a parent. And we want to make sure to decouple that, right? To make sure that it's not about your excellence or not excellence as a parent, that your
Yeah.
child is going through their own journey, and you want to be able to just talk to them through the lens of a growth mindset.
Goodness gracious, I love what you just said. I do. I so agree with you. And and to your point, at least my experience has been, I mean, overwhelmingly, the parents that I have interacted with over 15 years are really good parents. I mean, I've just had so few parents that I just, was really bothered by. But
Mm,
but like all of us as parents, man, once you enter the emotion in, and once you see your kid out there suffering, now you get into the whole idea of emotional intelligence, and you kind of
right.
maybe lose your cool. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
you get angry at the parent, or maybe you get overly nurturing, I guess you could say. even
Hmm.
from the stands. And so, to your point, approaching them and having a good sense of how you should deal with it, I think is important. Yes?
Yes, definitely. Because again, when you're in a situation where you're feeling as a parent emotionally dejected, angry, frustrated, it's difficult to hide it, right, from your child. But if they
Exactly.
lose and then you're kind of there, kind of, and I've seen it. I've seen parents when the child loses, they just walk off. They don't even want to deal with the child. And the child sees that and feels like, okay, if I, because I lost, my parent doesn't, care for me, love me, or what have you. And so you can have your moment of being emotionally dejected, but you want to be careful that it's not so obvious to the child that it then becomes, okay, my performance is linked to how much
Boy.
my parent will love or not love me. That's the dangerous piece of this. And look, I will say to your point, even with the parents that unfortunately that I see are being abusive to their child, I think their intention is, look, I want them to perform because I believe this is their path to go to the Ivy League or to, get into
Mhm.
college. So I'm so determined to really get them there that I'm angry when they don't perform. Right. And so there's that level of like, okay, having empathy for the parent through understanding what their intention is, ultimately their long-term goal. But the damage that they're doing to their child in the short term is the thing that I talk about. Like,
Yeah.
is it worth it for you to say, okay, my child will get into Ivy League school, but will have no relationship with me because I've treated them so poorly and sent this communication that their performance is the only thing that matters to me, that ultimately it severs, the emotional bonds.
Wow. I mean, I'm very serious. That's so powerful, and I'm sending all my parents here, to watch this and hear what you have to say about it. Now, I want to kind of switch a little bit, back to imposter syndrome, but maybe more in the workplace. But before we do that,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's apropos maybe to mention your book, Your Child's Greatness, your most recent book, you and your wife,
Mm-hmm.
Your Child's Greatness, A Parent's Guide to Raising Children Without Imposter Syndrome. Would you just go ahead and just looks like just came out, right?
So actually, it's coming out February 11th, which
Oh,
would
wait, what is
be,
today? Oh,
today's the 10th.
tomorrow.
So it's coming out tomorrow. So this is,
Very nice.
actually a wonderful time for me to be able to do that. So it is something we, as we said, are thrilled to do because we've been asked about this for so long. And so to have the opportunity finally to do something for parents and for children related to imposter syndrome is something that was a dream of ours. And so when we, unlike the first two books, our first two books were workbooks with models that took you step by step as to how to overcome imposter syndrome, how to deal with it in a toxic workplace. This is really keyed into as a resource for parents to help their children throughout all their developmental stages. And so, middle school, high school, college, post college, really being able to recognize not only how to overcome and deal with and prevent imposter syndrome, but how to deal with performance anxiety, reducing performance anxiety, how to combat perfectionism, which is to adopt, this growth mindset, how to form healthy relationships, how to really develop a healthy identity for yourself. And so we've constructed this model called the three B's that looks at each of these nine phases of how to actually help your child to develop a healthy identity, to be imposter syndrome free. And so we're certainly happy to be able now to share it with the world.
Man, I just love that. I say sincerely, I can't wait to point my parents and whomever else to this book because it just, I mean, to say that it's needed is probably an understatement in these days. But can you maybe share a tip or two from the book? Maybe one of the B's or all three, I don't
Sure.
care.
So
Whatever
so
you'd like to
I'll
do,
yeah.
please.
So let me talk about
Light
the
it
three
up.
B's. So the three B's are belonging, blooming, and being. And in belonging, we talk about the fact that in forming a healthy identity, ultimately we do want you to be mindful of, again, your skills, your talents, recognizing your worth and your greatness. So that's the first area that we talk about with that. And so what we recognize as we're going through is the key piece of it as well in belonging is forming healthy relationships. So really being able to think about what is a healthy relationship versus a toxic relationship. How do you make sure in your relationships where people value you and don't feel like somehow or another you are being treated or mistreated in your particular ways? And so that is, some of the key pieces when we're talking about belonging. And blooming is the piece where I think a lot of your parents will be very excited to kind of key in on, because when we look at that, we're talking about reducing performance anxiety. And this is something that oftentimes, whether it's in
Mm.
sports, whether it's in theater, dance, that parents aren't always able to share or talk about. They may feel embarrassed. They may feel like they don't want to, make their child feel that vulnerable, that they're dealing with a performance anxiety. So we go through this process of talking through how to actually deal with performance anxiety. And a lot of it oftentimes is before the actual performance, in mindset and really being able to think through and anticipate positive outcomes. Then it's during the performance, really being keyed in and locked into, again, thinking about what you do well. And then it's after the performance, because sometimes when you don't do well, you're ruminating about it and you're
Mm.
kind of feeling like, okay, I'm not necessarily going to do well. And then in that phase, we're talking about combating perfectionism. And so oftentimes you
Mhm.
feel like you need to be perfect. And if you're not perfect, then you're not good enough. So thinking about how much perfectionism is not the goal, that greatness is the goal. And ultimately, the last piece of blooming is really being able to learn how to cope with failure, that
Oh
we all are going to fail.
yeah.
And it's not necessarily the failure that dictates whether or not we are successful. It's really what we learn from the failure.
Mm.
And so that last phase of being, we then talk about how to internalize your success. That again, when you're dealing with imposter syndrome, you may say, "Well, I was lucky. That's why I was successful." No, the reason you were successful is because of your effort, because of some of the skills that you have.
Mm.
And then we go into this notion of how to regulate yourself emotionally and how to prevent yourself from burnout, because people who are dealing with imposter syndrome tend to overwork and are not always able to use the tools to think about how to actually emotionally regulate. And then the last area of being is forming healthy communities. So really leaning into having a community that supports your child, supports you as you're going through, different challenges or processes or successes, whether it's again academically, whether it's through a performance. And so we're super thrilled to be able to share that 3Bs model, and really taps into all the different areas I think that children and parents may experience in a child's developmental process, and really being able to help them through, again, not only through their areas of schooling, but post college. We also have a chapter on, some of the challenges of what we call failure to launch children, who might be dealing with things that parents are not mindful of. So either mental health challenges or learning disabilities, or other kind of neurodivergent challenges that might be impacting their ability to launch in the ways that the parent might want them to launch.
Rich, explain neurodivergence for our audience.
So this is a term that has really come to be
Fairly recent,
in
right?
vogue and recent,
Yeah.
in the past. And I think it's something that is more positive, because in the past we just say that they have a disability, right? Or they're disabled. And now we're valuing the fact that not everyone's brains work the same. And so the
Amen to that.
expectation that everyone has the same type of process. So when we're talking about neurodivergence, we're talking about some things that, atypical ways that people may operate. So when we're talking about neurodivergence, we're talking about people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We're talking about people who may be on the spectrum relative to autism.
Mm.
So we're talking about people who may also have other types of cognitive or learning concerns, and really being able to recognize whether it's a visual processing issue, whether it's an
Mm.
auditory processing issue, really being mindful that these individuals are also very intelligent, very able to succeed, but they have these unique challenges that we want to be able to address to help them again unlock their own greatness.
Wow. Ah, goodness. I'll tell you, this is so real. What I love about what you're saying and what truly makes me excited about even reading the book on your child's greatness. What you're saying is just it's not just eloquent, but it's just so real. I mean, I can really wrap my head around what you're saying. But let me ask real quick about imposter syndrome and kids. Now, it seems to me I wouldn't suspect that a young kid would know they have imposter syndrome, or would they necessarily at that age suffer from imposter syndrome?
Sure. So they may not know it, but these are some of the ways that we want parents to be mindful that a child may be developing it or dealing with it. So for instance, anytime that they do well in a academic setting, they do well on a test or do well in a performance situation, say in sports, and they always say, well, I was just lucky. I really wasn't that
Ah,
smart, or, every single thing is just attributed to luck. That's a signal of it. If they are given praise and they feel like they're unable to take it in, it's like they say, "Oh, you did such a good job." Oh, I don't think about that. I think that I could have done A, B, and C better. Or, they seem to really dismiss any type of praise. If you ask them, well, what did you think you did well? And they have difficulty internalizing any of their actual skills or talents. They say, I don't know. I don't think I did anything well. So these tend to be
mm,
some of the particular signals. If they say, oh, the reason I did well is because, Miss Jones likes me. That's why I did well on that test, or that's why I did well in that, sport or in that performance. These are all the signals. If you feel like they're always overworking, right? So there's a difference between working hard and overworking, where
mm,
someone feels like I need to constantly be doing something related to whatever type of effort that goes above and beyond whatever anyone else is doing, right? That it's not the norm, ultimately, for those who are successful. And it's not even necessary to overwork in that way. If they're extremely perfectionistic and they beat themselves up if they make mistakes and tend to ruminate about it, that's
mm.
another signal. So these are all signs, signals that a child may be dealing with imposter syndrome.
This makes me think of I want to just share a very I'll just keep it short here story of several years ago. Had this young girl, I think she was an eighth grader at the time. She's very tall, very, very tall. And kind of a big girl. I mean, I'm not even saying obese. She was just big,
Right,
you know.
big, right.
And she came out for tennis. Um, she was very shy. It was very apparent right from the beginning that she was uncomfortable. That I don't know, maybe her mom made her come out,
Hmm.
or I don't know exactly what it is. She's a very nice girl. I mean, but just
Right.
very quiet and shy. And I was aware of this in part because my wife is tall and she expressed
Mm,
some of this, but I just kind of, I mean, in my work was just sort of aware of some kids are really tall and they just feel like they stand out and so
sure.
forth. And so she came out and had never played tennis, and so get her on the courts, and I just watched her. She made I didn't cut anybody from the middle school team, and just started watching her play, and I was like, oh, this girl, she's got good hand eye, and she's got a little talent here. And I remember after two or three practices, we were finishing them up. The mother came over to the fence, and the young lady was there, and I'm not going to say her name because she should probably graduate. I'm sure she's graduated high school by now. So, and I remember telling her mother, I said, you should keep an eye on her. She's got some talent. And I
Mm,
looked at the young girl, and I just told her straight up. I said, I bet you're a little bit shy or feel awkward about your height compared to everybody. And she kind of giggled, and yes. And I say, listen, that's a real advantage in tennis. And I explained to her why. She has this
hmm.
longer stroke, can get to
Hmm.
the net, and the
Right.
serve is high, all these sorts of things. And she didn't really make a lot of expressions about it, but her mother later came back and said, that just changed her attitude about a lot of
Hmm.
things. And I said, well, I'll be honest with you, I'm glad, but I was telling you the truth. And then I don't know, it was maybe 2 years later. I just strolled over to one of the high school tennis games, which is the ones that I feed, one of them
Hmm.
that I feed. And I remember seeing all my kids, were in middle school, and it was just fun and hadn't seen them in a while.
That's
And
great.
then I looked over and saw her. I had no belief that she would stay with the game. And she
That's
was
great.
like one of the higher ranked players.
Wow.
And I was like, that's a different young lady right there.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I mean, I guess it sounds like I'm boasting, but I'm not. I'm really just trying to suggest. I don't know what I'm trying to suggest. What am I trying to say?
I think that, part of what we talked about is words matter,
Mm.
engagement with children matter, right? And so I think you were able to see her in who she was in that moment and in that time, and helped her to realize that something she felt very embarrassed about was actually a strength,
There you
right?
go.
That she could honor that and really appreciate it in a way that in the past she might have felt was a liability, was something that she didn't want to have, that she wanted to fit in. She didn't want to be so tall. And you're like, well, wait a minute, actually, in this domain, it will be an advantage for you. And that was something
Exactly.
she probably never heard before, right? And so I think that was powerful for her.
Oh, and she was just crushing it. It was such a beautiful thing to see. And I had one other who was in and she ended up getting to number one in high school, and she was just
Oh,
this
wow.
young strawberry hair, shy, a little bit of a giggly, freckles,
Right.
skinny, never played. And the same thing, she just turned and I was surprised because in middle school, she really didn't play very well. In fact, she never
Mm-hmm.
really, I think even, I don't even know if she got on like the main roster.
Mm.
But I just said the same thing to her, but I kept it real. I didn't make stuff
Right.
up.
Exactly.
And I
It was
feel that's
authentic.
very important, that you're not telling them something that they can't do anything about, you
Right.
know, or whatever
Yeah.
the case might be. This is so fascinating. So if I may, if you still have a little bit of time,
Sure.
okay,
Definitely.
let me shift over. And again, we'll mention all of these books. So your first two
Mm-hmm.
books, one of them is Own Your Greatness, I think is your
Mm-hmm.
first one, Overcome
Mm-hmm.
Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt and Succeed in Life. And that was from 2020. And then
Yes.
your Unstoppable Greatness is your second one, Break Free
Mm-hmm.
from Imposter Syndrome, Cultivating Your Agency, which I want to
Mm-hmm.
know about, and Achieve Your Ultimate Career Goals. And that came out in 2022. Congratulations. I've written a book, but three, I mean, you got to be a beast to do that. One of them almost took me down, I'll be honest with you.
I had some good help from my wife, so thankfully we we
Okay.
we, we double teamed it.
So, so just real quick, maybe do talk about, the impact on individuals in the workplace when it comes to imposter syndrome. And
Sure.
feel free
So,
to share about those books too, a little bit,
okay.
about what they're about. Yeah.
Sure. So the first book is really a step-by-step guide on your greatness to how to actually overcome imposter syndrome. And so we tend to really use models and models that we want people to be able to memorize and take away. So
Mm,
the first one was a three C's model. So clarify, create, and
mm,
ultimately the choose, clarify, choose, and create were the three C's. And we wanted people to feel like they could defeat imposter syndrome, because one of the strongest and most powerful myths is that you're not able to overcome it, that it's just something that you have, you'll always have, you'll just have to deal with it.
mm,
And so we talk about it again because it's not a mental health disorder, it's not about being cured of it, it's about reducing its impact in your day-to-day life. And so those particular doubts may creep up sometimes, but you've lowered the volume on them, and then
mm.
you're able to not have them be as intrusive
I
in your
love it.
day-to-day functioning, right? And so when we talk about, that this model, the clarify, choose, create, very quickly, clarify is talking about what your origin story is. How do you develop the actual imposter syndrome? Two, it's really being able to understand what your triggers are. So people with imposter syndrome tend to be triggered by new situations, meeting new people because they believe that they will be found out by this new situation, that if they take a new job, this is when they're going to finally be found out that they aren't able to do this, or when someone meets them, they will say, oh, they're not as smart as I thought, right? And so the last
Wow.
part of clarify is really being able to understand what your narrative is, that we all walk with a particular narrative, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And people with imposter syndrome tend to have what we call a thin narrative. That narrative is, I was lucky to be where I am. You know, someone helped me to do this. It's not because I'm smart or able. We talk about thickening the narrative, saying the reason that I'm successful is ultimately because I am a hard worker. I have great leadership skills. I have great communication skills. I have great problem solving skills. So that's the clarify piece of it. The choose piece of it starts with what we call speaking your truth, talking about the fact that you have imposter syndrome and not being ashamed of it, but also being able to own the skills and talents that you have. I think one of the most powerful pieces, though, for choose is what we call silencing ants. And ant stands for automatic negative thoughts. So these are the things that tend to sustain imposter syndrome. Those thoughts that you have that say, oh, when someone meets me, they don't think I'm smart. Or if I go to a new job, mind reading tends to be one of the powerful ants, that you know that you're reading other people's minds, that they're saying negative things about you, or fortune telling, that if I take this role, I'm going to be found out. So those ants tend to sustain imposter syndrome. And if you silence them and replace them with more positive self statements, the reason I'm successful, people will think that I'm smart. And the reason that if I do this, I will be successful tends to be what can really help people understand how to defeat their imposter syndrome. Because if you silence those ants, they no longer feed into, you know, your imposter syndrome. And then ultimately, the last piece of the choose is being able to take care of yourself. That people with imposter syndrome, so self care is important. People with imposter syndrome tend to overwork, neglect their own self care. And so we want people to be mindful of that. And so the last piece of it is create, is the first phase is being able to take on what we call new roles. People with imposter syndrome tend to have typical roles of, you know, the helper. They want to help everyone else, so they never ask for help. The super person, they feel like they need to do everything on their own. And so we talk about new roles are the collaborator, actually working with others, the help seeker, being able to help ask for help and not feel like it's going to expose you as not being smart or good enough. And then we talk about forming your dream team. So making sure you have people in your life who support you, mentors, cheerleaders, making sure you have a robust dream team, that when your imposter syndrome
I love
bubbles
that.
up, you can turn to these people and really, and they will support you in the ways that you need. Some may be just grounding you in terms of your emotional, you know, mindset. Some may be helping you to action plan how you deal with a particular problem. And then finally, the last piece of the model talks about optimal conditions for your performance. So understanding which aspects you need to address in defeating your imposter syndrome. Is it your narrative? Is it silencing the ants? Is it being able to speak your truth? And so after we wrote that book, what we found was a very interesting dynamic, that people would go through the book, talk about overcoming their imposter syndrome, be super excited, but then they go into these workplaces that were extremely toxic and triggering for them consistently. And
Mm.
so what we realized we wanted to do was to talk about how environments also are an important piece of sustaining imposter syndrome. And that's where the second book, Your Unstoppable Greatness, comes in. Cultivating your agency really talks about the fact that if you're in these toxic environments, you do have the ability to change, either change the culture or change your environment by leaving that toxic culture, and going through a process of really understanding how to do that. And so ultimately, that's what we talk about.
Explain when you say your agency. I mean, I believe I understand it, but for the
Mm-hmm.
folks that it's not a term that's often used. When you say your agency, what you're meaning.
So oftentimes people feel helpless, that if they're in an environment, say, that's toxic, they've got a boss that's constantly criticizing them, that's causing them to overwork, that's making them feel super insecure. They feel like, well, I have no other option. I need this job. This is, I have to stay. When we're talking about agency, we're saying, what are the elements in your control? What is your power to be able to impact your life and the direction of your life. And so when we talk about cultivating agency, it's exactly that, helping you to identify, well, what can you do? You're not stuck. You actually have skills and talents that will be valuable in the marketplace, and you can either try to change the culture by having allies that support you and being able to create a more healthy, workplace, or you decide if you've tried to do that and it's not actually the workplace hasn't responded, that you will have options to actually exit and transition into a healthier place.
Man, I love that. I also think about there are those, and I used to be this way, where you feel like you need to be, be all things to all people. It seems to me that could run, right? Is that running?
Mm-hmm.
Those
Mm-hmm.
imposter syndromes that have that.
Yeah. So it's the people pleasing that we talk about, right? So if again you came from a childhood or in a dynamic where you were
Hmm.
viewed or seen when you were pleasing, then you take that into the workplace and then you decide, well, the only way that, I can be valued is if I make sure I'm everything to everyone and I please everyone. And go out of
Mm,
my way to do that, which then kind of can cause harm to myself because I overwork and extend myself in ways that may not be healthy for me.
very, very well said. I love that. I love that. Well, goodness, I've just, I will point this out real quick because I think it's important, especially as we're talking about, um, uh, people, particularly say young adults or, even maybe high schoolers or college or young professionals and I just want you to comment on it,
Mm-hmm.
not about me, but about what I'm saying. And that, growing up going through school, I really was like, could barely pass my classes. I mean,
Mm,
I've told this story before in other podcasts, but I recall in the ninth grade when I was learning pre-algebra. I don't even think they
mm,
have pre-algebra anymore. And it and I remember the teacher putting, it was a very basic, because it was like just the very beginning of this semester or class or whatever.
mm-hmm,
And she put a very simple something on the wall and she explained it. And then she asked us to kind of work it. And then so had our heads down. And I remember staring at this thing and my brain just froze. It,
mm,
it, it, it made completely no sense. I didn't know, I couldn't even move.
right,
I couldn't even think about it. It
right.
and I'm looking around at other kids and I'm like, they all seem to be working it. And I remember my teacher walking around and she stopped and she watched me for a minute. And I remember just, you know, I didn't, I was embarrassed, but I was also like, I didn't
Mm-hmm,
know what to do. Now I'm
right.
distracted by her.
Sure.
And she leaned down and tried to maybe ask me some questions and help me. And I still just couldn't get it. And
Mm,
I think probably, for the right reasons, she just decided to move on. But she touched me on my shoulder and she said, "You'll get it." And I
mm,
remember, but the way that I took that, and she didn't mean it this
mm-hmm.
way, was like, um, I don't know, you ain't gonna get it, hey,
Right,
whatever it was. And she
right,
walked away, and I was so humiliated again, not by what she did, and I
right.
carried with me for a long, long time. And
Mm,
then just to move forward real quick, I barely graduated high school. I mean, I really did. I barely
mm,
graduated. I ended up going into the Air Force,
mm,
and shortly and a few years later, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years into my Air Force career, maybe when I changed into another career field. It was in human relations education, and I started finding my swag, if you will, and
mm-hmm.
I realized it was my creativity
Yes,
that
yes.
that and it took me a minute, but and my personality, my ability to interact. And over a period of time, it still took a long time, Rich, but over a period of time, I realized, and it's still true. I mean, I probably still couldn't do that pre-algebra
Mm-hmm,
thing, now here I am with a
mm-hmm.
master's degree, but I realized my swag was just somewhere else and I just had to discover it,
Yes,
you know.
yes,
Please
yes.
comment on that. Not about me, but about my point.
Yeah, and the point you make is such a poignant point because in essence, what we're talking about is this model of Gardner's multiple intelligences,
Mm,
right? And so when I talk about the fact that everyone has greatness in them, and unfortunately, the way the
mm,
society is constructed, it makes it feel like you can only excel in certain areas for you to be deemed great. So academically, really, and or in some sort of like sport. But the Gardner's multiple intelligences, in essence, says that everyone has unique skills and intelligence in different ways. That we tend to view intelligence as, from an academic lens only, right? That can you do well in
mhm.
math, for instance? And do well in science. If you don't, then you're not deemed as intelligent. He's talking about the fact, to your point, that you can be creative. You can have what he calls bodily kinesthetic intelligence. You can have
Mm,
creativity. So the multiple intelligences allows us to have a much more expansive understanding of our unique gifts and talents. That it may not be in pre-algebra. It doesn't need to, right? That is not the only way that you can be valued. And as you said, you got your swag when you were able to identify your creativity as the gift. And that's what we're constantly talking about. That unfortunately, again, it's not the intention of the teacher, not the intention of the schooling system, but it does create a very limited way for children to feel like they have worth and value because of the fact that if they're in this academic type of structured environment, they only believe, okay, my value, my worth, my intelligence is solely linked to A, B, and C if I did well and got these particular grades, rather than looking at, well, what is it that I actually do well in, right? And so most students are not exposed to having that ability to see what their multiple intelligences are, right? So whether
mm.
it's creativity,
Yeah,
whether it's being able to have, visual, spatial kind of unique strength. So that's what we're
mhm.
always wanting to cultivate, and glad that you were able to have that experience of identifying it.
That's
And
yeah, that's exactly right. And I also think it's important. I want to say that, and it wasn't just that my creativity helped me in the arts. I mean, I did a lot of work in music and these other so there was an artistic piece to
right,
that, but it helped me in my professional life.
right,
So it wasn't just that. So I learned to ask questions was just as
mm-hmm.
powerful as being able
Yes,
to state facts. And so
right,
I think it's important that people understand that what I'm saying is that I used it as a mechanism to deal with even more complicated things that maybe I couldn't do
right,
intellectually,
yes,
you see. So very
yes,
important. Well,
yes.
listen, my goodness gracious, you're a beast, man. I mean,
I
really,
appreciate it.
you bring such a wealth of not just again, I mean, just really lay it out there in such a compelling way that I sure hope that a lot of people watch this. Rich, where can people find information about you, your book, your wife and partner? I mean, just
Sure.
lay it out there, man.
Okay, so you can go to my website and it has all that information. It's dynamictransitionsllp.com. So it has information about our book, information about our services, information about my wife and I. And so you can go there. You can see me on and catch me on Instagram at Dr. Rich Orbé-Austin. I'm very active on IG. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So you can look at, Dr. Richard Orbé-Austin on LinkedIn. And for the book, we created a very unique and powerful, I think, resource through Instagram called at Smart Parenting Strategies is the handle,
Nice.
where we share information and resources and tips, advice about parenting and supporting children in all their unique developmental stages. So we're excited to have that. We'll be launching, I think, as well, a website for the book soon to come. So keep posted.
That's fantastic. I appreciate it. We'll put all of that, of course, in the show notes and all of that. And by the way, before I forget, I just want to say to my wife, I'm neurodivergent. I'm not nuts like you like to say. So just get that on
Fabulous.
record.
There you
But anyways,
go.
listen, what a pleasure it was. Thank you so much for taking the time and people go out and get this, okay? Get his
It's my
books and
honor.
no, thank you so much. So you take care and God bless, okay?
Thank you.